100 ghosts screamed for their killer, until the old soldier returned to confess his sins. The wind in Whispering Gulch didn't just howl. It had names. It spoke the names of the dead in a dry, rustling whisper that coiled through the crooked sagebrush. The town itself was new. The raw lumber of its houses still smelled of pine sap, but the land beneath it was ancient and unforgiving. This land watched as if it remembered things no man had the right to bury. Caleb stood at the edge of town, his back to the freshly painted houses, his face to the empty flatlands washed in sunset. His hands held no gun. They hung empty, but his shoulders slumped under a weight that was unseen. He hadn't come here to start. He had come here to finish. Then everything went silent. A carpenter's hammer stopped mid-swing. The laughter of children vanished. A thick, heavy silence fell as if the entire valley had just held its breath. And in that silence, he heard it. A beat, clear, thump, thump, not a hammer, not the beat of his own heart. It was the rhythm of a heart buried deep in the earth. It wasn't dying. It was waiting. Caleb didn't shudder. He just let out a long, slow breath, a plume of white dissolving in the cold air. He had been waiting 20 years for that sound. "Yeah," he muttered to the wind. "I'm back now." The wind in Whispering Gulch didn't just howl. It had names. It spoke the names of the dead in a dry, rustling whisper that coiled through the crooked sagebrush. Caleb rode into it, the sound a familiar torment he had carried in his ears for 20 years. The town itself was a fresh scar on an ancient landscape, its raw lumber buildings still smelling of pine sap and misplaced hope. The sharp rhythmic crack of a carpenter's hammer echoed in the clean air, a sound of progress that felt like a desecration. He dismounted at the livery, his movements stiff, the movements of an old man whose bones ached with more than just the miles. A boy no older than 16, with a face full of untroubled optimism, took the reins. "Howdy, mister," the boy chirped. "Just passing through or looking to set down roots?" Caleb's eyes drifted over the boy's head toward the low, brooding hills that framed the valley. "Something like that." He rasped, his voice rough from disuse. "Fine town we got here. Pa says it's the finest land in the territory. Gonna be the next big thing." The boy beamed. "Name's Whispering Gulch. Ain't it poetic?" Caleb looked at him, then truly looked at him, and saw the boy heard only the wind, not the words it carried. "It's a name," was all he said, turning away to find a room. He took a small room at the back of the boarding house, one with a window that faced the empty flatlands. The room was clean, smelling faintly of lye soap and lavender, but it felt suffocating, the walls too close, the silence too loud. He unpacked his meager belongings from his saddle roll. A spare shirt, a block of soap, a worn tin cup. No gun belt. No weapon save for the old hunting knife at his hip. He was not here as a soldier or a gunslinger. He was here as something else entirely. He sat on the edge of the lumpy mattress, the springs groaning under his weight. He closed his eyes, and the sounds of the town, the hammer, the distant laughter, faded, replaced by other older sounds. The jingle of cavalry spurs on dry earth. The sharp, clear bugle call for a charge. The scent of black powder and hot metal, and a fear so thick it was a taste in the back of his throat. A woman's cry cut short. His eyes snapped open. He was back in the quiet room, his heart pounding a frantic, panicked rhythm against his ribs. The ghosts weren't just in his memory anymore. He had brought them home. As evening bled across the sky, turning the clouds to shades of deep violet and bruised orange, he felt the need to escape the confines of his room. He walked his boots, kicking up the fine gray dust of the main street until he reached the edge of town where the last new building gave way to the untamed land. He stood there, his back to the freshly painted houses, his face to the empty valley washed in sunset. He hadn't come here to start. He had come here to finish. Then everything went silent. The carpenter's hammer stopped mid-swing. The tinny piano from the saloon vanished. A thick, heavy silence fell, as if the entire valley had just held its breath waiting. And in that silence, he heard it. A beat. Faint, but clear. Thump. Thump. Not a hammer. Not the beat of his own heart, which had suddenly gone still in his chest. It was the rhythm of something else, a pulse coming from deep within the earth itself. It wasn't dying. It was waiting. Caleb didn't shudder. He didn't flinch. He just let out a long, slow breath, a plume of white dissolving in the cold air. He had been waiting 20 years for this sound, this summons. Yeah, he muttered to the wind, his voice a low, gravelly whisper. I'm back now. The drumbeat faded with the last of the stars, leaving a silence that was somehow heavier than the sound it replaced. Caleb woke in his small boarding house room with the bitter taste of stale coffee and old ghosts on his tongue. He had not slept. He had merely waited for the sun, a silent, sleepless vigil with the memory of that subterranean heart. He walked out into the morning. Whispering Gulch was already alive with the determined clamor of a town convinced of its own bright future. But beneath the ringing of the blacksmith's hammer and the cheerful greetings, a new current ran, a low, anxious hum. He overheard it as he passed the mercantile, two women talking in hushed, urgent tones. Came out sour this morning, and pinkish, like it was watered with blood. All the horses down at the livery, too. Spooked something fierce last night. Jed said it was like a wolf got in there with them, but the door was still barred from the outside. Caleb pushed open the door to the mercantile, a small bell announcing his entry with a cheerful jingle that felt entirely out of place. The shop was neat and smelled of canvas-cured meat and something else, something dry and herbal like wild sage. A woman stood behind the counter, her hands methodically polishing a glass jar. She was not old, but her eyes held an ancient stillness. Her dark hair was braided with a few threads of silver, and her features held the elegant high cheekbones of her Cheyenne ancestors mixed with the pale skin of her father's people. She was a woman who belonged to two worlds, and therefore to neither. She looked up as he entered her polishing, slowing to a stop. Her gaze was not unkind, but it was deeply searching, as if she were taking the measure of his soul. "Can I help you, Mr. Coffee?" He said, his voice a low gravel. "Just the coffee." He moved to the large barrel of beans, but he could feel her eyes on him. They stood in a silence that was different from the one the night before. This was not an absence of sound, but an exchange of unspoken knowledge. The wind was angry last night, she said, her voice quiet and even. It was not small talk. It was a test. Caleb stopped, his hand hovering over the scoop. He turned to look at her, truly seeing her for the first time. He saw the same weary knowledge in her eyes that he felt in his own bones. "The wind here is always angry," he replied. Folks just started listening. A flicker of understanding passed between them. Her name was Lena. He learned it when the town mayor, a blustering man named Croft, came in to complain about the sour milk and the spooked horses. The day wore on the town's anxiety simmering just below the surface. Then, late in the afternoon, the hum of fear boiled over. A child was missing. A boy named Sammy, not yet 7 years old. The cheerful bell on Lena's door became a frantic, desperate alarm as the boy's mother ran in her face a mask of terror. A search party was formed, in minutes men grabbing rifles and lanterns, their faces grim. Mayor Croft was shouting orders directing them toward the woods. He was playing by the creek yesterday. Spread out, check the hollows. Caleb stood apart from the frantic activity, his gaze drifting in the opposite direction toward the vast, empty plains where the massacre had taken place. He felt a cold certainty settle in his gut. He's not in the woods. He turned and saw Lena standing in the doorway of her store, her arms wrapped around herself. She was also looking toward the plains. Their eyes met across the dusty street. The whispers are louder. That way, she said, her voice barely audible, yet he heard her perfectly over the shouts of the posse. Without another word, they started walking. They left the noise and the panic of the town behind, moving together into the unnerving quiet of the open land. The sun was beginning to set, casting their long shadows before them. He tracked the ground out of old habit, but it was her instinct, a sorrowful homing signal, that guided them. They found him near a solitary twisted juniper tree. Sammy was sitting on the ground, his back perfectly straight, staring out at the horizon. He was unharmed, but his eyes were vacant, and a chill emanated from him that had nothing to do with the evening air. As Lena knelt beside him, she saw what he was holding, clutched tight in his small fist. A smooth, black, teardrop-shaped stone. An old Cheyenne arrowhead worn by time and sorrow. She gently pried his fingers open and took the stone. The moment it left his skin, Sammy shuddered violently and gasped as if waking from a long, deep sleep. He looked around, his eyes flooding with confusion and terror, and began to wail for his mother. Moments later, the search party arrived, their relief quickly turning to unnerved suspicion as they saw where the boy was found. They hurried him back toward the warmth and light of the town, leaving Caleb and Lena alone in the gathering dusk. The wind was rising again, and with it the whispers. Caleb looked at the dark arrowhead resting in Lena's palm, then met her gaze. The time for pretending was over. "This is just the beginning," he said, his voice flat with grim certainty. Lena closed her hand around the stone, her knuckles white. "I know," she replied, her voice steady and clear. "What do we do?" The bell on the mercantile door was silent. Lena had locked it hours ago, turning her small, orderly shop into a sanctuary against the growing dread of Whispering Gulch. Lamplight cast long, dancing shadows over sacks of flour and barrels of nails, the air smelling of dried herbs and old wood. A small fire in the pot-bellied stove pushed back against the unnatural chill that had begun to seep into the town's bones. In the center of the room, on the worn wooden counter, lay the black arrowhead. It seemed to absorb the light, a small piece of eternal night. Caleb traced its edge with a calloused finger, the stone impossibly smooth. "It belonged to a dog soldier," he said, his voice a low rumble. The knowledge came from a place in his memory he kept locked away. One of their warrior societies. They were the last to fall. Lena watched him, her dark eyes reflecting the flickering lamplight. "They are not angry," she whispered, as if listening to a conversation only she could hear. "Not. Just angry. They are lost. Adrift. They are searching for something." What Caleb asked, the single word heavy with the weight of 20 years of guilt. Away home, she answered, her gaze fixed on the arrowhead. "A way to rest. This town you built with its bright paint and loud hammers. It's a cage, a lid on a boiling pot. It holds them here." He knew she was right. He had felt it the moment he arrived. He was a jailer returning to the prison he had helped build. "Then we have to go back," he said, the words tasting like gravel, "to the heart of it." They left before dawn, two solitary figures moving against the tide of the town's fear. The land was beautiful in the pale morning light, the plains stretching out under a vast empty sky. But it was a deceptive beauty. The wind that swept through the tall grass carried whispers, fragments of old songs, the echo of a child's cry. The land remembered everything. Lena led them not by sight, but by a pull he could feel in his own soul, a sorrowful magnetism leading them to a shallow depression in the earth, a gentle scar in the landscape. This was the place, the epicenter. Lena knelt, her hand hovering over the ground before pressing her palm flat against the dry, cracked earth. Her eyes closed. Caleb stood guard over her, his hand resting on the hilt of his old hunting knife, though he knew no blade could touch the enemies they faced here. He watched her face, saw her brow furrow in pain. He didn't see what she saw, but he felt it. The air grew heavy, thick, with the smell of smoke and blood. The whispers grew louder, coalescing into the sharp crack of rifle fire, the thunder of hooves, the high, terrifying shriek of the Cheyenne war cry. Lena let out a choked sob. "I see them," she gasped, her eyes still closed. "The smoke, the fire. I see a woman running, with a baby in a cradleboard." She. Lena's voice broke. She was my grandmother's sister. As Lena was lost in the vision of her ancestors, Caleb was thrown into a vision of his own. A figure materialized before him, not solid, but a shimmering distortion in the air, a memory given form by the power of this place. A tall Cheyenne warrior, his face painted for war, a single eagle feather in his hair. The man Caleb had killed. The spirit did not move. It did not speak. It simply looked at him, and in its gaze Caleb was forced to live it all again. He felt the heavy kick of the Springfield rifle against his shoulder. He smelled the acrid bite of black powder. He saw the look of shocked defiance in the warrior's eyes as the bullet struck home, and he watched him fall, his life spilling out onto the thirsty grass. The guilt was no longer a dull ache. It was a fresh, gaping wound, and he stumbled backward, a cry strangled in his throat. The vision shattered. Lena was on her feet, her face streaked with tears. Caleb was shaking, the strength gone from his legs. They had found no easy answers here, only a deeper, more profound pain. As they made their weary way back toward the town, they were met by a small group of men. Mayor Croft stood at their head, his face a mask of anger and fear. "Stirring up ghosts, were you, Croft?" accused, his voice sharp. "We had no trouble of this magnitude before you came back, old man." One of the others pointed a trembling finger at Lena. "And her with her Injun ways, you're bringing this curse down on all of us." Caleb was too tired to be angry, too hollowed out by the ghosts of his own making. He looked past them at the small, hopeful houses of Whispering Gulch. "You built your town on a graveyard," he said, his voice raspy and low. "The dead don't need us to stir them. They were never asleep." The town's rejection was a palpable thing, a wall of fear and suspicion that left Caleb and Lena utterly isolated. As they stood alone in the dusty main street, the sky above Whispering Gulch began to change. The brilliant empty blue of the afternoon bruised into a sickly violet gray. The wind, which had been a constant whisper, fell eerily silent. And then the dust began to rise. It did not blow in from the plains. It seemed to stir from the ground itself, rising in lazy, coiling tendrils of deep rust red. Lena clutched her arms, her gaze fixed on the unnatural sky. "They are coming," she whispered. "Get inside," Caleb said, his voice a low command. "Tell anyone who'll listen to bar their doors." Lena looked at him, her eyes filled with a sad wisdom. "It won't matter. The doors can't stop this kind of storm." She was right. The red dust swirled into a thick, choking fog, plunging the town into a surreal crimson twilight. Visibility dropped to near zero. Panic erupted. People ran for their homes, their shouts muffled by the thick air. Caleb stood his ground in the middle of the street, a solitary, unmoving figure. He would not hide. This was his reckoning, and he would meet it on his feet. Through the swirling dust they appeared, spectral riders on spectral horses, their forms shimmering like heat haze. The Cheyenne dog soldiers riding again. They galloped through the main street in an unnerving silence, their ghostly hooves making no sound on the hard-packed earth. They were not here to kill. Theirs was a more terrible purpose. As one rider passed through the wall of the saloon, a scream of pure terror erupted from within. Through the window, Caleb saw a wealthy land speculator on his knees, screaming as the deed in his hand crumbled into grave dust. He saw Mayor Croft collapse on his own porch, clawing at his face, seeing not a respected town leader in the window's reflection, but a grinning skeleton. The spirits were not inflicting physical wounds. They were holding up a mirror to the darkest corners of each man's soul, forcing them to see the rot within. Then the riders parted and a single figure approached Caleb. He was taller than the others, his presence radiating an immense, sorrowful authority. The chief. He stopped his spectral horse directly in front of Caleb, the chaos of the town fading into a silent, timeless bubble around them. The chief did not speak with a voice. The message was a vision, a torrent of memory and feeling poured directly into Caleb's mind. He saw the massacre again, not through his own eyes, but through the chief's. He felt the leader's heart-shattering grief as he watched his people fall, his warriors cut down, his culture burning. He saw the aftermath, the soldiers moving among the dead. He saw a younger version of himself, his face grim, pulling a sacred stone-carved pipe from a fallen warrior's belt. He saw his Captain Morrison grinning as he held up the chief's own painted shield, a trophy of a battle that was nothing more than a slaughter. The vision shifted. He felt the coldness of the earth, the feeling of being trapped, of a journey unfinished. The images were followed by a wave of pure, undiluted understanding that was not made of words. We are not here for vengeance. We are chained to this land by desecration. Our songs are broken. Our journey to the spirit world is incomplete. Make us whole. Let us go home. The vision shattered. The chief held Caleb's gaze for one final profound moment, then turned his horse and vanished back into the red maelstrom. The storm began to lessen its grip, the dust slowly settling, leaving behind the sounds of men weeping and whimpering in the streets. Lena rushed to Caleb's side. He had fallen to his knees, not from a blow, but from the sheer crushing weight of the revelation. "Caleb," she cried, her hand on his shoulder, "what did they do to you?" He looked up, his face a roadmap of grief and a new terrible clarity. "He didn't do anything to me," he said, his voice ragged. He took a shuddering breath, the dust settling around them like blood-red snow. "He told me how to end it. They're not hunting us, Lena." He met her eyes, his own filled with a desperate, burgeoning hope. "They're asking for our help." The red dust settled like a bloody shroud over Whispering Gulch, leaving a silence more profound and terrifying than the storm itself. The townsfolk, those who dared to emerge from their homes, moved like ghosts in their own lives, their faces pale with the memory of the horrors their own souls had shown them. The spectral riders were gone, but their judgment lingered in the crimson-tinged air. In the lamplit quiet of the mercantile, Caleb and Lena stood over the black arrowhead. They were no longer just a haunted old soldier and an outcast shopkeeper. They were emissaries chosen by the dead to settle a debt 20 years past due. Morrison Caleb set his voice a low rasp. He finally spoke the name of his former captain, the founder of this town, a name he had tried to bury deep within himself. He was a collector of trophies. The shield I saw in the vision, the sacred pipe, he would have seen them as symbols of his conquest. He wouldn't have destroyed them. He would have kept them. Lena's dark eyes were fixed on the street outside where the red dust coated every surface. "He founded this town," she said. "He built the first 3 buildings with his own hands before the rest of the settlers arrived. The mayor's office, the church, and this very store." Caleb's gaze sharpened. "Then that's where they'll be. Hidden, buried like the bodies they were stolen from." He knew they couldn't do it alone. The artifacts would be hidden behind walls of wood and stone, but the true barrier was the town's fear. They needed to turn that fear into action. Their first stop was the office of Mayor Croft. They found him not behind his desk, but slumped in a chair beside it, a half-empty bottle of brandy in his hand. The bluster and arrogance had been scoured from him, leaving behind a terrified, hollowed-out man who had seen his own skull grinning back at him from his reflection. "What was that?" Croft stammered as they entered, not even trying to hide the bottle. What in God's name was happening out there? A reckoning, Caleb said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "You finally saw what this town is truly built on." Lena stepped forward, her presence calm and commanding. "The spirits don't want to harm us, Mayor. They want to rest. They are chained here. We need your help to find what Captain Morrison stole from their people." "This is madness," Croft whispered, shaking his head. "Indian curses. Dark magic." "It is not magic." Caleb cut in, his voice low and firm, filled with the undeniable authority of his experience. "It is a debt. And this land is the collector. We can help them find peace, or we can all be washed away in their sorrow. The choice is yours." Croft looked from Caleb's hard, resolute face to Lena's steady gaze, and he remembered the vision of his own skeleton. His fear of the spirits finally outweighed his fear of his neighbor's judgment. He swallowed hard and nodded. "The building plans," he said, his voice trembling. "They're in the back." Morrison was proud of his work. The search began. They scoured the mayor's office, tapping walls, checking for false bottoms and drawers, finding nothing but the mundane secrets of a corrupt small-town official. The whispers were a constant presence, a faint chorus of sorrow at the edge of their hearing, as if the spirits were watching, waiting. Hope began to dwindle. Their last chance was the church. The small wooden structure stood at the end of the main street, its white paint now stained red by the dust. Inside it was cold and silent. Dust motes danced in the weak light, filtering through a simple stained glass window, depicting a pale, serene shepherd. With the help of Croft and the town blacksmith, a brawny man who had seen a vision of his own hands forging chains for his children, they began their search there. The altar, Lena said suddenly, her eyes distant. He would have hidden it under the holiest place. The ultimate desecration. Using a crowbar, the blacksmith pried at the floorboards at the foot of the altar. The wood groaned and splintered. Beneath it was not dirt and foundation stone, but the flat, rusted lid of a military footlocker. A profound sense of awe and sacrilege filled the small church. The sound of the blacksmith breaking the old lock echoed like a gunshot in the hallowed silence. He threw the lid back. There, nestled in rotting canvas, lay the stolen soul of a people. The chief's ceremonial shield, its painted symbols of the eagle and the buffalo, still vibrant after 20 years in the dark. The stone-carved peace pipe, its bowl cool to the touch. And a small beaded leather pouch filled with sacred herbs, their scent faintly miraculously still clinging to it. They were real. The visions were real. As Caleb reached a trembling hand forward, not daring to touch, but only to feel the presence of the shield, a new silence fell. The whispers stopped. The air grew still. Every man in the room held his breath. This was not the silence of waiting. It was the silence of anticipation. The spirits knew. With a deep, groaning creak that echoed the pain of the land itself, the great wooden door of the church swung slowly open on its own, revealing the red-tinged twilight outside. The time had come. The final ceremony was about to begin. The open church door was a wound in the night, spilling the scent of old hymns and unearthed secrets into the red-tinged air. For a long moment, no one moved. The discovery of the footlocker, a rusted iron heart full of stolen history, held them all in a state of terrified reverence. It was Caleb who broke the spell. He knelt, his old bones protesting, and reached into the box. His hands, which had once wielded a rifle on this very land, now closed around the chief's ceremonial shield. It was heavier than he could have imagined, weighted not with wood and leather, but with the memory of a murdered generation. Lena stepped forward and gently took the stone-carved pipe and the beaded medicine pouch. Mayor Croft and the blacksmith watched, their faces pale. The time for denial was over. The time for atonement had arrived. They walked out of the church, a small, somber procession, into the anxious twilight. The remaining townsfolk had gathered, their faces illuminated by the eerie red glow that still lingered in the sky. There were no shouts, no accusations now. Only a vast, watchful silence as the small group, the haunted soldier, the keeper of memories, and the humbled leaders of the town walked through the main street away from the raw lumber houses and toward the open plains. It was a funeral procession 20 years too late. They reached the shallow depression in the earth, the heart of the massacre site. The air here was still and cold thick with a sorrow that was almost a physical presence. As they stepped onto the sacred ground, the spirits appeared once more. They materialized from the swirling dust, dozens of spectral warriors on silent, ghostly horses, forming a great, silent circle around the depression. They were not riding in a frenzy. They were not attacking. They were here as witnesses. At their head, seated on a magnificent war pony, was the spirit of the chief. Lena moved to the center of the circle. She held the pipe and the medicine pouch not as artifacts, but as extensions of her own soul. She began to speak, her voice low and clear, a mixture of English and the few precious Cheyenne words her grandmother had taught her. She spoke of the land's pain, of broken circles, of the long, lonely winter of the spirit. She spoke not as an accuser, but as a daughter, asking for peace for her lost family. Her voice was a bridge spanning the chasm between the living and the dead. Then she looked at Caleb. It was time. He walked forward, the heavy shield held before him like a confession. He stopped in the very center of the circle of spirits, his gaze locked on the impassive, sorrowful face of the chief. The weight of 20 years of running, of drinking, of hiding, pressed down on him. "I was here," he began, his voice a ragged, broken thing torn from the depths of his soul. "I was a young man. I was full of orders and ignorance. I held a rifle." His voice cracked. "I didn't see people. I saw enemies. I didn't hear songs. I heard war cries. I was wrong." He looked from the chief to the silent circle of warriors, his eyes pleading. "We took more than your lives. We took your journey home. We took your peace. We built our hope on your despair." He fell to his knees, the movement a final total surrender. "I cannot give you back what was lost. God knows I would if I could. But I can return what is yours. I can give you my shame. I ask for your forgiveness." With a reverence he had not felt since he was a boy in a church long ago, he carefully placed the chief's shield on the ground. Lena knelt beside him, placing the sacred pipe and the medicine pouch next to it, making the offering whole again. The moment the last object touched the earth, a profound change occurred. A soft, golden light pulsed from the artifacts, spreading outwards. A new wind began to blow, clean and cool and fresh, and it swept the last of the red dust from the valley. The spirits began to fade. Their shimmering forms grew transparent, their faces, once etched in the agony of their unended battle, now softened into a deep, weary peace. The chief held Caleb's gaze one last time. There was no anger. There was no vengeance. There was only release. The spirit gave a slow, solemn nod, a gesture of acceptance across the veil of worlds. Then he turned his spectral horse and rode not into the darkness, but into the rising light of the dawn, his warriors following him on their silent journey home. The haunting of Whispering Gulch was over. As the last spirit vanished, the strength that had held Caleb together finally gave out. The weight he had carried for 2 decades was lifted, and there was nothing left to anchor his weary soul to the world. He collapsed, his head coming to rest in Lena's lap. "Caleb," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "They're gone. They are at peace." He looked up past her face to the sky that was now a brilliant, clear blue. A faint, peaceful smile touched his lips. "So am I," he breathed, and he closed his eyes. They buried him on the hill overlooking the now hallowed ground. The people of Whispering Gulch did not build a statue to their founder. Instead, they began to build a simple stone memorial, one for the Cheyenne who were lost, and one for the old soldier who had in the end brought them all home. Lena stood watching the sun rise over a land that was finally truly at peace. The whispers were gone, replaced by the quiet, hopeful sounds of a town beginning to heal. The lingering chill has finally lifted from Whispering Gulch, but Caleb's long-buried confession and Lena's unshakable faith still ripple through every empty street, proof that facing our deepest guilt can set even restless spirits free. If that final reckoning in the valley moved you, tap. Like to honor their courage and share their journey with anyone who believes in redemption against all odds. Next week, we'll step into the glow of the saloon's lamplight for our 10th tale. A mercy-driven cowboy stakes everything on a single poker hand to win a young girl's freedom from debt. Expect high-tension, desperate stakes, and the kind of showdown where every card could mean life or death. Subscribe now and ring the bell, because in the untamed West, sometimes the deadliest battles are fought not with bullets, but with the turn of a card.